So Joe Rogan interviewed Saad the other day. The full interview is 2.5 hours long. Don't worry, I'm not going to be playing a 2.5 hour video. But, Joe Rogan's kind of the everyman. His attitudes, his opinions tend to reflect the opinions of a lot of regular Americans who, frankly, don't know a whole lot about the issues that they have opinions about. And there was a 10-minute segment of this interview that touched on a number of issues that I want to talk about, that I really want to address some of what was raised by Joe, and also some of what was raised by Saad. So I'm gonna break up this segment, but let's go ahead and see the first bit of Joe Rogan and Saad. Here we go.
So the idea that ultimately all religions are simply preaching the same indistinguishable thing in slightly different ways is simply not true. But it feels good to think that, right? It's empathetic for us to think that. We should never speak amongst mixed company about politics and religion. So therefore, if I start saying something that might be pejorative of another religion, that feels icky, that feels gauche, right? And that's why, by the way, earlier you mentioned that when we were talking about this, when I asked you, are Americans more likely now to talk openly about Islam? You said, well, the Democrats are more terrified to do so than the Republicans.
Yeah.
But even the Republicans are to some extent suicidally empathetic, because if you watch even the ones who very forcefully criticize Islam as being incongruent with, American values, they'll always use linguistic coverage to protect Islam. So it's Islamism.
Yes.
It's radical Islam. It's radical.
Don't you agree with that?
No.
No?
Not at all. So political Islam and Islamism is a indelible, inherent feature of Islam. Much of Islam is Islamism. So if you do a content analysis of all of the canonical texts of Islam, which are the Quran, the Hadith, the deeds and the sayings of Muhammad, and the Sirah, which is the biography of Muhammad, you could do a quantitative analysis of how often is it preaching brotherly love, how often is it really concerned about the infidels, and so Islam in its nature is political. Why? There are many reasons why, but let me just give you one. And then if you want to drill down, we can do so. Islam is a fully proselytizing religion, meaning that it is incumbent in an ideal world to turn the entire world into the one true faith. It is a peaceful religion, if by peaceful it means the following. Eventually, the entire globe, every millimeter of the globe, will be united under the unifying flag of Allah. Now, let's take, for example, Judaism. And it's not because I'm Jewish, but it's just to compare. Judaism is precisely the opposite. It is an anti-proselytizing language. You're not allowed to proselytize. As a matter of fact, if you proselytize, let's say I try to convince you, Joe, why don't you join the tribe? And you say, you know what? I think I'd like to.
It's a grind.
It's a grind. Exactly.
It's a long haul. My uncle did it.
Well, there you go. Thank you. So it is literally in the canons of Judaism to try to dissuade the prospective convert to coming into the fold, because the idea is to have a costly signal of your commitment, your religious piety, to want to join the group. So it is a grind. It's very hard. In Islam, you just have to say the one proclamation, the Shahada, one sentence, and you're in. Now, try to get out. There are apostasy laws against you getting out. So the circuitry of Islam is one that is expansionist. That's why you have 2 billion Muslims. 1 out of every 4 human beings is Muslim. And it only took 1,400 years for that. So from a marketing perspective, as someone who studies consumer behavior, Islam is a brilliant marketing religion. It has found a way to get a lot of customers and adherents. Judaism sucks at marketing, because the entire circuitry of Judaism is meant to keep it very, very small. And so which one is likely to lead to greater problems? The one that is meant to ensure that all of us become Muslim, or the one that says, even if your uncle wants to become Jewish, we're going to put the barrier so high that nobody will ever become Jewish? So we still have only 15 million Jews, roughly, in the world. almost the same as we had before the Holocaust. So Judaism sucks as a marketing religion, Islam incredibly successful.
Okay. So God Saad is brilliant. And he makes a good point here about Islam being proselytizing and expansionist. But I want to push back slightly on the reason he gives for Islam being inherently political. And he said there's other reasons, but he's just going to bring up one. So I'm sure he would agree with what I'm saying. Because it's easy to compare it to Judaism and talk about proselytization, but Christianity also proselytizes. Christianity absolutely wants everyone in the world to accept Jesus. That's the goal of Christianity. So you could say, well, Christianity might, by that measure, the measure of proselytizing, Christianity is just as political as Islam. But Christianity is not political. We don't consider Christianity a political movement. It doesn't behave that way. Why not? Because the issue with Islam being political is not that it seeks to convince the world to accept their faith. It's that Islam seeks to govern the world. And that means govern everyone, including those who don't accept their faith. And that's why there's rules for second-class citizenship for people of other faiths. But the goal of Islam is to govern the entire world, to bring the entire world to heel, to submit to Islam. That's the distinction. And I've made this point before on this channel. The goal of Islam, according to its own theology, is definitionally a political goal. It is governance. It is rule. So under Islamic law, the non-believer has two options. They could submit to Islamic authority and pay a special tax as a second-class citizen, and there's all sorts of rules about how they have to give respect to Muslims, etc. Or they could accept death. Okay, that's not a faith mission. That's a political mission. That's what makes Islam categorically different from Christianity, and why I say Islam is a political movement that has a religious dimension, has a religious component to it, has a religious infrastructure under it. But it's not a religion. It is a political movement, meaning in practice, that's what it seeks. What it seeks is a political goal. So it's not a religion that happens to have political elements. It's the reverse. Now, with regard to Judaism, so God Saad is right that Judaism does not proselytize, that we discourage it, that when people come to convert, we try to push them away, and then they have to really show their commitment. It's true. And he talks about it as a test of commitment, which is true. But there's another dimension worth adding, because Judaism is also non-expansionist politically and territorially, which is a huge outlier when it comes to religious ideas. Even in the Bible itself, the nation of Israel is given a land that has specific defined borders. It's a very small piece of land, but has very specific and defined borders. This is your land, and beyond it is not. So Judaism definitionally has no goal of ruling over the world or ruling over other people's lands. It has no goal of world governance. It's the opposite of Islam in every dimension, in both faith, proselytizing, and in terms of governance. Okay, so why doesn't Judaism seek converts? Because this is a question that God doesn't address, and it is one of the weirdest things about Judaism. So strange. If you think of it simply, if you believe that your faith is the truth, why aren't you trying to spread it with the world? It seems kind of obvious that every faith should be proselytizing. Every faith should want to seek other people, especially Judaism, which is so tiny, has been so persecuted over the centuries. Why doesn't Judaism actively seek converts? So God talks about it as a marketing failure because we have this test of commitment. But I'd like to frame it differently. It's actually by design. In Exodus chapter 19, right before the covenant at Mount Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, and the chapter before that, I mean, the Ten Commandments are chapter 20 of Exodus. So chapter 19, which is the prep for the Ten Commandments for the revelation at Sinai, God refers to the Jewish people. He says that he will make them a kingdom of priests, mamlechet kohanim in Hebrew, a kingdom of priests. Now, the word priest, kohen, doesn't only refer to the family of Aaron, the high priest. It's actually much more of a generic biblical word that refers to people who serve in a ministering priestly role. For example, even the pagan priests of Baal are called kohen. It's the same word. So a kingdom of mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of kohens, a kingdom of priests, or in modern English, we would say a society of priests. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that everyone's clergy. It means that there's a priestly role that the nation of Israel is meant to play. Okay, so if the nation of Israel are the priestly community, who is the flock, right? A priest doesn't try to turn everyone else into priests. A priest serves the flock. They serve the congregation. They help the congregation. They help the flock draw closer to, or they, to the God, to the deity that they're worshiping. They help them in their worship. So when Isaiah talks about the nation of Israel as a light unto the nations, when God tells Abraham to bring blessing to all the families of the earth and to teach all the families of the earth justice and righteousness, but he also makes a particular covenant, the covenant of circumcision and the covenant of law. He makes the particular covenant with the nation of Israel, but he wants the entire world to recognize God's values, God's morality. That's how Judaism defines itself. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not Judaism lives up to this, or whether Judaism has been successful in this. That's a very interesting conversation about to what extent we can interpret the history of the Jewish people as a success or failure in this regard. Okay, that's a whole other topic. We're talking about definitionally how the religion defines itself. Okay. Judaism wants the entire world to have faith in the God of the Bible. We talk about objectives of religions, right? The objective of Islam is to govern the world. The objective of Christianity is for everyone in the world to accept Jesus. The objective of Judaism is for the entire world to have faith in the God of the Bible and to embrace the values of the Bible, the basic moral values of the Bible, not to become Jewish. The Jews are the catalyst, and they're meant to play a central role, and they're the priestly nation meant to help the world draw closer to God. Okay, it's not bad marketing. It's just a completely different mission. And that's what the Jewish mission is. That's what just a little bit there that God Saad, I think, missed. Let's get back to the clip. Now we'll watch the second half of what I wanted to share with you.
In this country, the concern with Judaism is the support of the Israeli military.
Right.
That's the concern. The concern is the amount of influence that it has on the United States government, how we got into the Iran war, why we give them so much influence over our military, over our decision-making, over our politicians. I mean, AIPAC famously promotes and supports a tremendous amount of politicians in the United States. That's the big fear, is that there's an inordinate amount of influence that Israel has over foreign policy, our decisions, and even our political structure in the country.
Right. Several ways to tackle this. Say the Iran war. Take Israel out of it. Do you think there are multiple countries that would share in the recognition that probably Iranian regime that has an eschatology that basically says the end of times requires that there is sort of death to everybody before the final imam comes back? Would it be a good idea for the Brits or the Romanians or the French or some of the other the Gulf countries, would they be happy if Iran had a nuclear weapon? So to frame the issue of the U.S. is attacking or is involved in the attack on the Iranians as, the United States doesn't have personal agency. They're all wood crickets that are being puppeteered by this incredibly powerful lobby called Israel. That simply doesn't pass the smell test. Of course, Israel has shared interests with the United States, as most allies would, where they both agree that probably an Iranian regime that has nuclear weapons would not be a good thing for world peace. And so because these two countries have maybe greater testicular fortitude than the NATO countries, it seems as though the Israelis are puppeteering the Americans. But do you really think that Donald Trump is sitting and saying, had I not been such a weak guy with no personal agency, I wouldn't have fallen sway to the incredibly influential Zionist lobby?
Well, it's not just incredibly influential. It's the amount of financial support they gave his candidacy. And again, all the different politicians that are beholden to Israel. That's the concern that a lot of people on the right and on the left have here in America.
So
most people in America do not support this war. It's the large percentage of people think it was a bad idea.
what are your thoughts?
I don't think it's a good idea.
Why?
But because first of all, it doesn't seem to have a clear resolution, right? It's like we went over there because we were told that they were very close to developing a nuclear weapon. But if you paid attention to what Netanyahu has said over the last few decades, it's always been they're a year away, they're 2 months away, they're whatever it is. I mean, he's been doing this forever, ever since he spoke at the UN and had that giant cartoon bomb. Remember the like fucking Looney Tunes bomb?
Yeah.
Like,
When he spoke
with the percentage of
I remember that. Yeah.
enrichment of uranium.
Mhm.
He's wanted this for a long time. There's also a deep concern that he is only in office because of the war, and he has corruption charges in Israel, and that in order for him to stay in power and for him to avoid going to trial, he has to continue war.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah. Let's suppose you go to see your physician and your physician says, hey, Joe, God forbid, it looks like your blood sugar is very high and I'm going to classify you as now, never mind pre-diabetic, I think you're diabetic. And if we don't manage your sugar levels, there will come a day where I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. We're going to have to amputate your extremities. You're probably going to lose your eyesight. You're probably going to have sexual dysfunction, and you're probably going to have some cardiovascular incident. That doesn't happen on day 2 of you having been diagnosed with diabetes. Like there's a trajectory, and at some point there'll be a tipping point where until then, none of the diabetes complications happened. And why am I saying all this? Because I can't comment as to whether he's been lying all the times when he said there's 2 more years left or 1 more year or 6 more months. But surely we can grant the American government enough leeway to presume that if they thought that at this point it's the right time and it is now intolerable for them to go another day with the current reality, that they probably had some intelligence that suggests that they are close. So I can't comment whether Netanyahu was pulling our eyes, but surely it can't be that the Israelis are so manipulative in their puppeteering that they've pulled the wool over the American eyes. And really, there's no danger that the Iranians were posing, and we've convinced the Americans to go to war. Do you think that it is that?
Well, I wouldn't say there's no danger, right? So here's one thing that we do know. They had said that their missiles could only reach a certain distance. That proved to not be true,
right? Because
of the Diego Garcia missile launch, right? So they have missiles that are capable of reaching Europe, and that was not something they had said before. We know that they have enriched their uranium beyond what they need for nuclear power,
right?
And that they're within striking distance of developing a nuclear weapon,
right?
But wasn't it true that they had it's hard to know as a person sitting in a podcast studio in Texas, exactly what their ruling had been, but that they had only done this in order to avoid the possibility of them being attacked, that they would get close to a nuclear weapon. So at least it would deter some potential attacks on them, and that they were doing this out of self-interest.
Okay, we'll stop it there. That's a good place to stop it. And yeah, we might as well just pull it down also. Okay, let's take these points one at a time. So first of all, on the issue of Israel controlling Trump, which is the overarching point that Joe wants to make here. Israel controls the U.S. government. Israel controls Trump. The claim that the U.S. is in this war because Israel, has some blackmail leverage over Trump, or controls Trump, or pulled the wool over his eyes, or Trump didn't really want to do this but was pressured. It requires you to believe something that is impossible for me to believe, and that is that Donald Trump, who is perhaps the most transparent politician in American history. He tells you exactly how he feels about everyone. I mean, he telegraphs how he feels about people all the time. And that somehow he's this brilliant actor who's secretly, he's doing Israel's bidding while concealing it completely and very cagily lying and saying, I mean, is he really that good at concealing what he really feels? If he felt that his arm was being twisted by the Israelis or they didn't really want to do this, somehow he's concealing all of that in every single press conference. He talks about this issue every single day, and he's always concealed that and just praises Bibi every chance he gets and talks about how close the partnership is and and his conviction about Iran not having a nuclear weapon, and that it's all a show, and that somehow this incredibly transparent, blunt person on this one issue is really, really good at being so deceptive and is a great actor. Look, Trump has been publicly hawkish on Iran since 1988. There's this famous clip of him from the 80s saying that Iran has been making America look like fools, and if they fired one shot at one of our ships, we should go in and take their oil. He talked about Karg Island. It's almost 40 years ago. Trump's position on Iran has never changed. And it's not something the Israelis put in his head. It's been his position his entire life. Now, on the issue of the money, that, the U.S. spends all this money in Israel, and I've talked about this many times. Yes, Israel receives $3.8 billion in U.S. military aid annually, and that sounds like a lot. And officially, they are the largest recipient of annual aid. But look at what the U.S. spends everywhere else. The U.S. has massive military bases just to take the Middle East, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Cyprus, and then in Europe, Germany, all across Europe. There are bases everywhere. And there are no U.S. bases in Israel. None. Because Israel doesn't need U.S. bases. It fights for itself. Now, if you add up the costs of running those bases, the personnel, the equipment, those bases dwarf the $3.8 billion that Israel gets. But the $3.8 billion that Israel receives is listed as aid. The bases across Europe and the Gulf and the other parts of the Middle East are listed as defense spending. So yes, technically Israel gets the most aid, but if we look at the footprint, the amount of money that is spent by the U.S. on military expenditures in other countries, Israel's probably not even in the top 10. It's just different labels on the money. So when you look at it honestly, Israel's a remarkably cost-effective ally. And if you look at the money as some sort of evidence of Israel controlling the U.S. government, again, compare it to the money that the U.S. is spending on other nations. It's not even close. And then Rogan brings up this point about Netanyahu crying wolf about Iran's nuclear program, where he's been saying for so many years that it's always a year away, and this goes on. And he brings up his famous speech at the UN with the picture of the bomb, and he's always talking about, for 10 years already or more, we keep hearing how close they are to the bomb, and a lot of people roll their eyes at this. But here's what Joe Rogan's skepticism ignores. It's not just Joe Rogan. Again, as I said at the beginning of this video, Joe Rogan's kind of the avatar for how a lot of Americans think. It's never occurred to him that the reason that it kept taking longer for Iran to get close to a bomb over all those years, longer than Netanyahu's prediction when he held up that bomb picture, is because Israel kept slowing it down throughout all those years. But you have to pay attention to know this. There have been assassinations of nuclear scientists. There were Stuxnet and other cyber operations. Israel famously stole the entire Iranian nuclear archive. There have been sabotage operations going on throughout long before these last, the war of, the current war and the war this past June. Israel's been running sabotage operations on the Iranian nuclear program for a long time, decades long, covert operations to set back Iran's nuclear advances. So the timeline kept getting pushed back because of those operations, but the Iranians kept building workarounds, building underground facilities, etc. So the fact that Netanyahu's been saying for so long that they're close to a nuclear weapon, and it's like the boy who cried wolf, that is a misunderstanding. It's not that the evidence of the threat was exaggerated. Okay, I hope that was clear. But Rogan's got this thing like, that why this war, why now? And he brings up this premise, which is the main premise you hear in opposition to the war, that the premise was that this was a war to stop an imminent nuclear weapon. But that's a straw man. And it requires you to not actually listen to what the administration says. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been clear about this from the beginning of the war, that the issue was not the imminence of Iran having a nuclear weapon. The issue was Iran's ballistic missile program, because Iran had ramped up production to over 100 ballistic missiles per month. And that they ramped it up after the 12-day war, meaning the relief that they got after the 12-day war, they did not use to make life better for their people. They used it to ramp up their ballistic missile program. And they were ramping up the number of missiles they were producing per month, and they were ramping up the range of those missiles. So the danger, as Marco Rubio said, the danger was that once the program reached a sufficient scale, the ballistic missile program reached a sufficient scale, it would provide a defensive shield, an umbrella, under which Iran could pursue nuclear weapons without any ability to stop them. That's the problem. The problem isn't how close they were to a nuclear weapon. The problem is how close they were to creating a ballistic missile umbrella to shield them from any attempt to stop them from making a nuclear weapon. Okay, that's the issue here that he misses. And that's why the war had to happen now, because they had to act before that window closed, the ballistic missile cover window. Now, regarding that point, he says about Netanyahu staying in power to avoid going to trial. Now, this is just, he has no clue about Israeli politics. Like, he says that Netanyahu's only in power because of the war. Kind of in his mind, he's kind of comparing it to Zelensky, who in Ukraine canceled elections because of the war, used the war as cover to cancel elections. Now, Netanyahu he was elected prime minister, and the term hasn't finished yet, and it's going to finish soon, and there are going to be elections in Israel this fall. So it's not that he's staying in power because of the war. It's not like one has nothing to do with the other. It's not staying in power he's staying in power because he's serving a term as prime minister that he was elected to serve, and the term isn't over yet. And I mean, the bigger issue with saying that he's keeping the war going to stay in power to avoid going on trial for corruption. Here's the problem, Joe Rogan. Netanyahu has been on trial throughout much of this war. In the recent months, the recent year, he has spent many days in court for those exact trials. Those trials are ongoing. He is literally on trial right now. So if the theory is that he's prolonging the war to avoid prosecution, that's not working, because the trial's actually happening. So the theory doesn't hold up against the basic facts. But Joe Rogan doesn't know anything about Israeli politics, but he has a big platform, so he spouts things out of his mouth. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, his last point that he makes in that clip, that he heard that Iran was pursuing weapons to serve as, for self-defense, to prevent them from being attacked. Now, a lot of countries have nuclear weapons, and they have them for that reason. It prevents them from being attacked, right? The reason that you can't unseat Kim Jong-un from North Korea, who's one of the most brutal dictators in the world, terrorizes his own people. The punishment for becoming Christian in that country is routinely death. I mean, the reason we can't get rid of him is because he has a nuclear weapon. But he's not about to fire it at anyone because he doesn't have a goal of destroying the world. So Rogan is kind of, and a lot of people say this, like, well, how dangerous could it be for Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Look, Pakistan's a Muslim country. They have a nuclear weapon, but they miss the point. See, this framing assumes that Iran is like everyone else. Even the bad actors of nuclear weapons aren't about to use them. So we kind of think, oh, there's no big deal if another bad actor gets one, right? Russia's got nuclear weapons. They're not good guys. North Korea, they're not good guys. Pakistan, they're not so great. They all have nuclear weapons, and it's not a threat. So that's why in people's minds, even the threat of nuclear doesn't seem so outlandish to them. But the Iranians don't want nuclear weapons to prevent their regime from being brought down, because that would assume that the ideology of the regime is a normal self-preservation ideology. But again, even though Saad mentioned it here, I guess it just went over Rogan's head, or he ignored it. The ruling clerics of Iran are 12er Shiite Muslims. Their eschatology, right, their theology of the end times, is that the Mahdi, their messianic figure, the 12th Imam, is summoned to the world by bringing the world to a point of apocalyptic chaos. Okay, this is their faith. Like if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus is going to come back and everyone's going to have faith in Jesus, whatever it is. Like their eschatology is that the Mahdi comes into the world, but what summons him into the world, their Messiah figure, what summons him is the apocalypse. And that they're supposed to, and this is what makes this particular brand of Shiite Muslim so insane. Goes back to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Their belief is that they bring the Messiah, they bring the Mahdi by destroying the world, by bringing the world to apocalypse. So they are not building nuclear weapons to deter attacks from other countries. This is their theology. Now, you could say that they don't really mean it. I don't know what evidence you have for that. And that's a risk that I'm not willing to take. But this is why every other nuclear power in the world is governed by a logic that is completely different. They're governed by the mutually assured destruction deterrence logic, but that does not apply to the Iranian regime. You know, there's a lot more I could say about this Joe Rogan clip and many more clips. I mean, I could probably do a whole series of videos on this interview because they touched on a lot of topics that are worth talking about. Maybe I'll do another one, but for now, we'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it interesting. Please like, share, subscribe, all that great stuff. Please tell people about this channel. Word of mouth is the best way for things to spread, and I'm very grateful to all of you for helping grow the channel. Make sure you're subscribed not only to this channel, but to Israel 365 News, and that you're receiving our newsletters. I'll have some news in the coming days about some upcoming events that I want to tell you about, but we'll leave it there for now. God bless.